Frozen War Inflexible Sacrifice, the human who earned the medal, had been dead for exactly 3 minutes and 47 seconds when the emergency medical pod brought him back to life. The cold vacuum of space had frozen his blood, stopped his heart, and turned his skin blue as ancient ice. But humans, as the galaxy would soon learn, were remarkably difficult to kill permanently. The medical bay of the Coalition starship Harmony buzzed with alien voices speaking in a dozen different languages. Dr. Ra, a tall, crystalline being from the consortium, watched the humans' vital signs climb back to normal with what could only be described as professional amazement. Her people had been part of the Galactic Coalition for over 2,000 years, and she had never seen anything quite like this. "How is this possible?" she asked her assistant, a furry creature named who looked like a cross between a bear and a butterfly. His core temperature dropped to -40 degrees. His heart stopped completely. By all known medical science, he should be brain dead. Check the readings again, his 6 eyes blinking in sequence. The scans show minimal brain damage. Whatever humans call hypothermia protocol seems to have protected his neural pathways. It's like his body just shut down safely and waited. Opened his eyes slowly, the bright lights of the medical bay making him squint. Everything hurt, but he was alive. More importantly, he remembered why he had been floating in space in the first place. The memory hit him like a physical blow. "The children," he whispered, his voice rough from the breathing tube they had just removed. "Did they make it? The evacuation pods?" Dr. Ra leaned over him, her crystalline face reflecting the medical bay's lights like a prism. "You need to rest, human. You have been through severe trauma." "The children," repeated, trying to sit up despite the restraints. "From the colony ship New Hope. There were 47 of them in the escape pods. Did they reach the Coalition fleet?" The doctor exchanged a look with. They had found floating near the wreckage of what had once been a civilian transport vessel. The attack had come without warning, deep in what everyone thought was safe space. The Empire had violated 3 treaties and 2 ceasefire agreements when their warships opened fire on the colony convoy. "They are safe," said softly. "All 47 children made it to our ships, but human, how did you end up in open space? The wreckage suggests the New Hope was destroyed almost instantly." Closed his eyes, remembering. The alarm had been so loud it hurt his ears, red lights flashing everywhere, the ship shaking like a toy in the hands of an angry child. And then Captain Torres on the intercom, her voice steady despite the chaos. "All civilians to escape pods. This is not a drill." He had been in Section C when the first plasma cannon hit the ship. The impact had thrown him against a bulkhead so hard he saw stars. But between him and the nearest escape pod bay were the children's quarters. 47 young beings from 6 different species, all traveling with their families to the new agricultural colony on 442B. The second impact had been worse. The lights went out, and emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Through the ship's intercom, he could hear Captain Torres coordinating the evacuation. The crew was doing everything they could, but there simply weren't enough escape pods for everyone. "Standard evacuation protocol," had muttered to himself as he ran through the twisting corridors. "Adults give up their pod slots for children, no exceptions." It was a human concept that had caused quite a stir when Earth joined the Coalition 50 years ago. Most species had complex social hierarchies that determined who got saved first during emergencies. Some prioritized the oldest and most experienced. Others saved the strongest and most capable. A few even had complicated lottery systems. Humans just said, "Children first." The idea had seemed almost primitive to many Coalition species. Why save the weakest and most helpless first? It made no logical sense. But over the decades, as humans served alongside other species in the Coalition fleet, that simple principle had saved thousands of lives and earned grudging respect across the galaxy. Had reached the children's quarters to find chaos. The automatic doors had malfunctioned, trapping 3 dozen young beings inside. Their guardians and teachers were trying to force the doors open, but the ship was losing structural integrity fast. Every impact from the weapons made the situation worse. "Stand back," had shouted, pulling out his emergency plasma cutter. It was standard equipment for all Coalition civilians traveling in contested space, though most people never expected to use it. The plasma cutter had made short work of the malfunctioned door, but precious time had been lost. By the time they reached the escape pod bay, most of the pods were already launching. Captain Tor's voice came over the intercom again, strained now. All pods launching in 60 seconds. If you're not in a pod by then, find an emergency shelter and wait for rescue. 47 children. 14 available pods, each designed to hold 3 beings safely or 4 in an emergency. The math was simple and terrible. "We can squeeze more in," insisted a tall, blue-skinned who taught xenobiology at the colony's planned university. "Some of the children are small enough that we could fit 5 per pod." Had looked at the terrified faces surrounding him. A pair of young siblings, their crystal skin dim with fear. A group of human children ranging in age from 5 to 14. Several furry youngsters huddled together for comfort. 2 teenage whose scales were turning purple with stress. "No," he said firmly. "Emergency cramming kills more beings than it saves. 3 per pod maximum. That's Coalition safety protocol for a reason." "But that left 5 children without pods." "I'll stay with them," volunteered teacher. "We can find an emergency shelter and wait." Had looked at her kind, determined face and felt his heart break a little. Emergency shelters were designed to keep beings alive for maybe 6 hours in the best conditions. The New Hope was breaking apart around them. There wouldn't be any rescue coming in time. "Get in a pod," he told her. "Take 3 of the little ones, I'll handle the rest." What happened next would be debated in coalition military academies for years to come. Later, that literally picked her up and put her in an escape pod with 3 of the smallest children. She said he moved with a speed and determination that seemed almost supernatural, loading children into pods and launching them one by one. The last 2 children, both human siblings named Amy and Carlos, ages 8 and 6, looked up at with complete trust. Their parents had been killed in the first attack, and they had been clinging to each other in the corner of the children's quarters. "Are we going home?" little Amy asked. Knelt down to their level, trying to keep his voice calm even as the ship shuddered around them. "You're going somewhere safe. The nice people on the coalition ships will take care of you until we can find your relatives." "What about you?" Carlos asked. At 6 years old, he was already sharp enough to notice that there was only 1 pod left and 3 of them standing there. Smiled, and later would say that smile haunted her dreams for months. "I'm going to make sure you 2 get out of here safely." He had boosted both children into the last escape pod, checked their safety harnesses twice, and activated the launch sequence. As the pod bay doors opened and the little craft shot out into space, could see other pods scattered around the area like seeds from a dying flower. The children were safe. The ship lurched again, and this time felt the artificial gravity flicker. He was out of time. The New Hope had maybe 30 seconds before complete structural collapse. That was when made the decision that would echo across the galaxy. Instead of running for an emergency shelter that wouldn't save him anyway, he grabbed an emergency space suit and headed for the external airlocks. If the ship was going to explode, he wanted to be as far from the children's escape pods as possible when it happened. The space suit was one of the newer models, designed for exactly this kind of emergency. It had enough life support for 4 hours and beacon transmitters that would help rescue ships find survivors. The only problem was that the nearest airlock was 3 sections away, and the ship was disintegrating around him. Ran through corridors that were warping and twisting as the New Hope superstructure failed. Sparks flew from damaged systems, and he could hear the hull groaning like a living thing in pain. Behind him, secondary explosions marked the death of various ship systems. He made it to Airlock 7 with less than 10 seconds to spare. As he slammed his hand on the emergency release, the New Hope finally gave up its fight against physics. The explosion was visible from 3 light minutes away, a brief new star that flared and died in the cold vacuum of space. But was clear of the blast. The emergency suit's automated systems had thrown him away from the ship at maximum velocity the moment the airlock opened. He tumbled through space, watching the burning debris of what had been his home for the past 6 months scatter across the void. His radio crackled with coalition fleet communications as rescue ships moved to collect the escape pods. One by one, he heard confirmations that the children had been recovered safely. 47 young lives saved, exactly as planned. The only problem was that in all the chaos, no one had noticed one missing adult. It was just another piece of debris floating in space, and his emergency beacon was damaged in the explosion. The rescue ships collected all the pods and departed for the nearest coalition base, assuming all survivors had been accounted for. floated alone in the dark, watching the distant lights of the Coalition fleet disappear into hyperspace. His suit showed 3 hours and 42 minutes of life support remaining. The nearest inhabited system was 6 light-years away. He was going to die out here, and he was okay with that. 47 children were alive because of what he had done. That seemed like a fair trade. But space is vast and full of surprises. 3 hours and 39 minutes later, just as was beginning to feel drowsy from oxygen deprivation, sensors on the Coalition cruiser Harmony detected an unusual energy signature. The ship's captain, a methodical being named from the hegemony worlds, ordered an investigation. They found floating unconscious in his emergency suit, his life support exhausted, and his body temperature dropping rapidly toward absolute zero. By the time they got him aboard, his heart had stopped, his brain activity was minimal, and any reasonable doctor would have pronounced him dead. Any reasonable doctor except Ra, who had spent the past 20 years studying human physiology and was fascinated by their species' unusual adaptability. Humans have what they call a mammalian diving reflex, she explained to Captain as they worked to revive. When exposed to extreme cold, their bodies can shut down non-essential functions and preserve brain activity for extended periods. It's similar to hibernation, but much more dramatic. The captain watched the revival process with professional interest. How long can they survive like this? The longest recorded case was a human child who fell through ice and was submerged in freezing water for 45 minutes. Complete recovery, no brain damage. But this human was in vacuum for nearly 4 hours. If he survives, it will be a new record. And survive he did. As lay in the medical bay, slowly warming back to normal body temperature, word of his actions spread throughout the Coalition fleet. The story was almost too dramatic to believe. A single human who had saved 47 children by giving up his own escape pod, then somehow survived in space long enough to be rescued against impossible odds. Admiral, the commander of the sector fleet, reviewed the reports with growing amazement. He had commanded Coalition forces for 35 years and had never seen anything quite like this. The human had followed no standard protocol, ignored multiple safety regulations, and violated several emergency procedures. And he had saved 47 lives while doing it. "Sir," reported his aide, a young named, "I have testimony from 17 witnesses, including teacher and all the older children who remember what happened. They all confirm the same story. Human deliberately gave up his escape pod and chose to remain behind." Admiral drummed his clawed fingers on his desk, a sign of deep thought among his people. What's the Coalition's official position on actions like this? Emergency Protocol 7 specifically forbids adults from giving up assigned escape pod slots to children unless all adults are accounted for first. The regulation was created after the vegan crisis 15 years ago, when too many adults died trying to save children and left entire colonies without leadership. The Admiral nodded. He remembered the vegan crisis well. An entire generation of children had survived a planetary evacuation, but without enough adults to guide them, the colony had failed anyway. The regulation made sense from a practical standpoint. But it also meant that had technically violated Coalition emergency protocols. By the book, he should face disciplinary action. However, continued, reading from his, there is also the human precedent clause, established during the Altair incident 12 years ago. When human emergency responses conflict with Coalition regulations, field commanders are authorized to evaluate the situation on a case-by-case basis. Admiral leaned back in his chair, remembering the Altair incident. A human merchant captain had violated 3 different treaties by crossing into hegemony space to rescue survivors from a mining accident. Technically, the action had risked starting a war. Practically, it had saved 400 lives and demonstrated to the hegemony that the Coalition valued individual life above political convenience. The peace treaty signed afterward had been much more favorable to the Coalition than anyone had expected. "Schedule a hearing," the Admiral decided. "I want to speak with Human personally once he's recovered, and I want testimony from all the survivors." 3 days later, stood before Admiral in the Harmony's main briefing room. He still looked pale from his ordeal, but his eyes were clear, and his voice was steady as he answered questions about the evacuation. "Did you know that by giving up your escape pod, you were violating Coalition Emergency Protocol 7? the Admiral asked. Yes, sir, I'm familiar with the regulation. And did you know that your actions could have resulted in your death? Was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Sir, with respect, my actions did result in my death. I died out there in space. The fact that Dr. Ra was able to bring me back is unexpected. Admiral studied the human's face carefully. In 35 years of command, he had learned to read the expressions of dozens of different species. Humans were particularly interesting because their emotions showed so clearly on their faces. This human showed no signs of regret, fear, or self-pity. He looked like someone who had made a difficult decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. Do you understand that your actions, while brave, set a dangerous precedent? If other coalition citizens start ignoring emergency protocols to play hero, more lives could be lost in future disasters. Sir, I understand the concern, but I'd like to point out that 47 children are alive today because I ignored that protocol. In my opinion, that's not a dangerous precedent. That's exactly the kind of precedent we should be setting. The Admiral's aide shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Human, you can't possibly believe that individual judgment should override carefully designed emergency procedures. Those protocols exist for good reasons. Turned to look at the young, and his expression became very serious. Officer, have you ever been in a real emergency? Not a drill or a simulation, but a situation where people were actually going to die. His blue skin flushed slightly. I have completed all required emergency training scenarios. That's not what I asked. Voice was patient but firm. Have you ever had to choose between following a regulation and saving someone's life? The room fell silent. Admiral was watching this exchange with great interest, curious to see how his aide would respond. No, admitted quietly, I have not. Nodded. Then with respect, sir, you don't understand what you're talking about. Emergency protocols are guidelines, not commandments from the gods. They're designed to save the maximum number of lives in typical situations. But when the situation isn't typical, when the protocols would actually result in more deaths, then any thinking being has a responsibility to adapt. He looked around the briefing room, making eye contact with each of the officers present. 47 children are alive today. Their families will see them again. They'll grow up, have children of their own, contribute to their communities. Some of them might become doctors, teachers, explorers, or artists. One of them might even join the coalition fleet and save lives of their own someday. Paused, letting that sink in. How is that not worth one adult's life? Admiral leaned forward. Human, what you're describing sounds like a purely emotional response. Good military decisions are based on logic and planning, not feelings. Sir, with respect, I disagree. Every military decision ultimately comes down to what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice to protect those values. That's not logic. That's philosophy. The Admiral's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of surprise among his people. Explain. The coalition exists because we believe that cooperation is better than conflict, that diversity makes us stronger, and that every species has something valuable to contribute to the galaxy. Those aren't logical conclusions. They're value judgments. They're things we feel in our hearts and choose to defend with our minds. Gestured toward which showed the outside the ship. Every time we send ships into danger to rescue strangers, every time we share technology with species that might someday become our rivals, every time we choose diplomacy over warfare, we're making emotional decisions. We're saying that we care more about building something good than about protecting ourselves. He looked directly at Admiral. The moment we start making purely logical decisions, the moment we stop caring about individual lives because the math doesn't work out, is the moment the coalition becomes just another empire, just another group of beings using force to get what they want. The briefing room was absolutely silent. Admiral had commanded coalition forces through 3 different conflicts, and he had never heard a junior civilian explain the philosophy of military service quite so clearly. And you believe that saving those children was worth violating coalition protocols? He asked finally. Sir, I believe that saving those children was exactly what coalition protocols should encourage, not prohibit. If our emergency procedures would have resulted in 47 dead children, then our emergency procedures are wrong. Admiral stood up, his impressive height making him tower over the human. For a moment, thought he might be about to face serious disciplinary action. Instead, the Admiral did something that no one in the briefing room expected. He saluted. "Human," Admiral said formally, "your actions during the evacuation of the New Hope demonstrated courage, selflessness, and sound judgment under extreme pressure. While your methods were unorthodox, your results speak for themselves." Unsure how to respond, returned the salute awkwardly. "Furthermore," the Admiral continued, "your explanation of coalition values and military philosophy shows a deep understanding of why we serve. The coalition fleet needs more beings who can think clearly under pressure and adapt to unexpected situations." He gestured to his aide. "Prepare the paperwork for a field commission. I'm offering Human a position in the coalition fleet with the rank of lieutenant." The young's eyes widened. "Sir, field commissions require approval from Sector Command." "Then get me Admiral Ra on subspace. I'll speak with her personally." Raised his hand uncertainly. "Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to be a coalition officer. I'm a civilian engineer. I fix environmental systems and water recyclers." Admiral's expression was unreadable, but there was something that might have been amusement in his 4 eyes. "Human, in my experience, the beings who think they're not qualified to lead are often exactly the ones who should be leading. And after what happened on the New Hope, I suspect you understand military priorities better than some officers who've been in the fleet for decades." He moved to the looking out at the stars. "Besides, the coalition fleet needs engineers who understand that their primary mission isn't maintaining equipment. It's protecting the beings who depend on that equipment." Was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the offer. 3 days ago, he had been a civilian passenger on a colony transport, looking forward to spending 2 years helping build infrastructure on a new agricultural world. Now he was floating in space aboard a coalition warship, being offered a military commission by one of the most decorated admirals in the fleet. "Sir," he said finally, "if I accept this commission, what would my duties involve?" "Initially, you'd be assigned to the engineering department here on the Harmony. We're heading to the frontier sectors, where the Empire has been getting more aggressive lately. We need someone who can keep our life support systems running and our emergency procedures working when things get complicated." The Admiral turned back to face. "But more importantly, we need someone who can train other engineers and officers to think the way you thought during that evacuation. To understand that our job isn't just to follow procedures, but to save lives." Thought about Amy and Carlos, the 2 children he had put in that last escape pod. By now they would be safely aboard a coalition transport, heading toward a refugee station where social services would help them find relatives or adoptive families. They would grow up safe because he had made one decision in a moment of crisis. How many other children might face similar situations in the months and years to come? How many other decisions might need to be made by beings who understood the difference between following rules and doing what was right? "I accept the commission, sir," said. "When do I start?" Admiral smiled, an expression that looked genuinely terrifying on his predatory face, but which somehow understood was meant to be reassuring. "You already have, Lieutenant. Welcome to the Coalition fleet. Frozen War, Inflexible Sacrifice, the human who earned the medal." Lieutenant had been serving aboard the Coalition cruiser Harmony for exactly 6 months when the Empire declared war on the entire galaxy. The declaration came through official diplomatic channels at 3:47 hours, ship time, while was elbow-deep in the primary life support recycling unit. The announcement echoed through the ship's corridors in 17 different languages, but the meaning was the same in all of them. The Empire rejected all treaties, claimed the right to expand into any territory they could take by force, and considered any resistance to be an act of aggression that justified total warfare. Wiped his hands on a maintenance rag and headed for the engineering department's main console. Around him, the Harmony's crew moved with the controlled urgency that marked professional military personnel facing a crisis. No one was panicking, but everyone understood that their lives had just become much more complicated. "Status report," called Chief Engineering Officer, a 6-armed hexapod whose species had been building starships for longer than humans had been using fire. Her multiple hands danced across control surfaces as she brought all ship systems to full readiness. "Primary life support is operating at 103% efficiency," reported. "I just finished replacing the secondary filtration matrix. We can support full crew for 47 days without resupply." compound eyes turned toward him, a sign of approval among her people. Emergency power. All backup reactors tested and ready. We can maintain basic life support and maneuvering power for an additional 12 days if the main reactor goes down. Weapons systems. That was area of responsibility, one that still felt strange after 6 months of military service. All plasma cannon arrays are charged and ready. Torpedo bays are loaded with standard ordnance. Point defense systems show green across the board. The chief nodded, her multiple arms continuing to work at different stations. Good work, Lieutenant. Now comes the real test. As if summoned by her words, Admiral's voice came over the ship's intercom. All senior staff to the briefing room. Emergency tactical conference in 5 minutes. The briefing room was already crowded when arrived. The Harmony carried a crew of 437 beings from 26 different species, and their senior officers reflected that diversity. Still felt slightly out of place among them. 6 months ago, he had been a civilian engineer. Now he found himself sitting next to commanders who had decades of military experience. Admiral entered with his usual purposeful stride, followed by his aide and the ship's senior intelligence officer, a tall, thin being called whose species seemed to be made entirely of shadows and starlight. The situation is straightforward, the Admiral began without preamble. The Empire has ended all pretense of diplomacy and declared total war on the Coalition. Intelligence estimates that they have been planning this move for at least 2 years. Stepped forward, her form shifting and flowing like smoke given substance. Our agents report massive fleet movements throughout territory. They are concentrating their forces for what appears to be a coordinated strike against 17 different coalition systems simultaneously. A holographic star map appeared above the briefing table, showing coalition space in blue and territory in red. 17 blue systems pulsed with warning indicators, each one representing millions of civilian lives suddenly in danger. The good news, Admiral continued, is that coalition intelligence saw this coming. Our own fleets have been quietly repositioning for the past month. We won't be caught completely unprepared. He gestured to one system near the edge of the map, highlighted in bright yellow. The bad news is that we're being sent to 442. Felt his blood turn cold. 442 was the system where the New Hope had been heading when it was destroyed. It was home to the agricultural colony that Amy and Carlos and 45 other children should have reached 6 months ago. Commander, the ship's tactical officer, leaned forward in his chair. Sir, what's the strategic situation at 442? 3 battle groups are converging on the system, replied. Approximately 60 warships, including at least 8 heavy cruisers and 2 dreadnoughts. Their objective appears to be the complete destruction of the colony infrastructure and civilian population. The briefing room was silent except for the quiet hum of the ship systems. 60 warships was a formidable force, more than enough to destroy any normal planetary defense. Coalition response? Asked Chief Medical Officer Ra. Admiral's expression was grim. Task Force 7 under Admiral Ra, 42 ships, including the heavy cruisers Defiance and Unyielding, will be part of the escort screen for the main battle line. Did some quick calculations in his head. 42 coalition ships against 60 vessels was not good odds, even with superior coalition technology. The battle would be close, and close battles meant high casualties on both sides. What about the civilian population? He asked. Has over 2 million colonists now. Evacuation is all ready, Admiral replied. But with 60 ships incoming, there's no way to get everyone out in time. We estimate that at least 40% of the civilian population will still be on planet when the enemy arrives. 800,000 civilians. Thought about Amy and Carlos, who should have been among them if their transport had made it safely to 442. Instead, they were safe on a coalition refugee station, protected by his decision to violate emergency protocols 6 months ago. When do we engage? Asked Commander. We rendezvous with Task Force 7 in 18 hours, the Admiral said. The fleet will arrive at approximately 6 hours after that. We'll meet them at the edge of the system and try to delay their advance long enough for more civilians to evacuate. Shadowy form shifted uncomfortably. Admiral, intelligence projects coalition casualties at 30 to 40% in a direct engagement. They have been upgrading their weapons systems significantly. Noted, but our orders are clear. Defend at all costs. Those colonists are coalition citizens, and we don't abandon our own. The Admiral looked around the briefing room, making eye contact with each of his senior officers. I won't lie to you. This will be the largest battle most of us have ever seen. They are betting everything on these coordinated strikes. If they succeed here, if they can prove that the coalition can't protect its own colonies, then other systems will start to surrender rather than face destruction. He stood up, his impressive height making him tower over the briefing table. But if we can stop them, if we can prove that the coalition will fight for every citizen and every world, then this war might end before it truly begins. The choice between freedom and slavery for billions of beings may be decided at 4:42. The meeting broke up with quiet efficiency as officers returned to their departments to prepare for battle. Found himself walking alongside Chief Ra, who had been unusually quiet during the briefing. You're thinking about the children from the New Hope, she observed. The ones you saved. Nodded, they should have been on by now if their ship had made it. Instead, they're safe on Station Harmony because their transport was destroyed. Ra's crystalline features reflected the corridor's lighting as she considered this. Do you think your actions 6 months ago somehow changed the course of events? That by saving those children, you altered their fate? I don't know, admitted. Maybe. Or maybe they would have attacked that convoy whether the children were aboard or not. The important thing is that 47 young beings are safe instead of being trapped on a planet about to be invaded. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment before Ra spoke again. I've been thinking about what you said during your commission hearing, about the difference between following procedures and doing what's right. What about it? We're about to face 60 warships with 42 of our own. Standard tactical doctrine would suggest a fighting retreat, trying to inflict maximum casualties while preserving our own forces. But that would mean abandoning 800,000 civilians. Stopped walking and looked at her carefully. You think Admiral is making the same kind of decision I made on the New Hope? Aren't you, choosing to risk our lives to protect beings who can't protect themselves? Before could answer, the ship's intercom crackled to life. All hands, prepare for hyperspace jump in 30 minutes. Secure all stations and equipment. This is not a drill. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Spent most of his time running diagnostics on critical systems, making sure that everything would work when the shooting started. He also found himself thinking about the upcoming battle and what it might mean. The Empire had been a threat for as long as humans had been part of the coalition, but they had always limited themselves to small raids and border skirmishes. This coordinated attack on 17 systems represented something new and dangerous, a commitment to total warfare that could reshape the galaxy. If they succeeded, if they could prove that the coalition couldn't protect its member worlds, then the careful alliance that had brought peace to hundreds of systems would begin to crumble. Fear would drive species back into isolation and competition. Trade would collapse. Scientific cooperation would end. The galaxy would return to the dark ages of constant warfare between suspicious neighbors. But if the coalition could hold, if they could prove that their values were worth fighting for, then this war might be the crucible that forged something even stronger. Shared sacrifice often created bonds that could last for centuries. Was running a final check on the emergency life support systems when the ship dropped out of hyperspace at the rendezvous point. Through the viewports, he could see the assembled might of Task Force 7, 42 coalition warships arranged in a defensive formation that spoke of both strength and determination. The fleet was a perfect representation of coalition diversity, sleek destroyers with their distinctive blue hulls, massive battleships that looked like flying fortresses, elegant cruisers that seemed to be made of living crystal, and scattered throughout the formation the practical, blocky designs that marked human engineering. Admiral Ra's flagship, the heavy cruiser Defiance, was an impressive sight. 3 times the size of the Harmony, it carried enough firepower to destroy a small moon, and armor thick enough to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a planetary defense cannon. But even with all that firepower, knew they were facing a difficult fight. The Empire built their ships for one purpose: maximum destruction. They weren't elegant or efficient, but they were brutally effective in combat. Task Force 7 to all ships, came Admiral Ra's voice over the communications system. Enemy fleet detected at long range. 61 vessels confirmed, led by the dreadnought Blood Tide. They will reach in 4 hours, 23 minutes. Felt his stomach clench. The Blood Tide was legendary among coalition forces, a massive warship that had been terrorizing the frontier for over a decade. It was said to be armed with enough weapons to level a city and armor thick enough to shrug off anything smaller than another dreadnought. All vessels will advance to intercept, Admiral Ra continued. Remember, our job is to protect the civilian evacuation. Every minute we can delay the enemy advance means more lives saved. The next few hours passed with agonizing slowness. Found himself checking and rechecking systems that he had already were working perfectly. Around him, the rest of the crew went through their own pre-battle rituals. Weapons crews loading ammunition, medical teams preparing for casualties, damage control parties standing ready to repair battle damage. Finally, long-range sensors detected the approaching fleet. On the main, tiny dots of light marked enemy vessels, still too far away to show any detail but close enough to represent immediate danger. "All hands to battle stations," came Admiral's calm voice. "This is not a drill." Strapped himself into his engineering station and brought up the damage control display. If the Harmony took hits during the battle, it would be his job to keep her fighting for as long as possible. The responsibility felt overwhelming. "Nervous?" asked Chief from her position at the main engineering console. "Terrified," admitted honestly. "Good, terror keeps you sharp. Overconfidence gets you killed." The fleet resolved into individual ships as they approached the outer edge of the 442 system. Had seen intelligence reports about their vessels, but seeing them with his own eyes was different. They looked like weapons given shape, all sharp angles and aggressive lines. Even their names reflected their violent nature. Leading them was the Blood Tide, a massive dreadnought that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Had studied the technical specifications of dreadnoughts, but numbers on a data pad couldn't convey the sheer menace of the real thing. "Enemy fleet changing course to intercept," reported the tactical officer. "They're moving to engage rather than bypass our position." Admiral's voice came over the intercom. "Attention all hands. The enemy has chosen to fight rather than avoid us. This means they're confident they can destroy our fleet quickly and still have time to attack the planet. We're going to prove them wrong." Watched his displays as the two fleets maneuvered toward each other like ancient sailing ships preparing for battle. Coalition vessels moved with practiced precision, while the ships advanced in a loose formation that emphasized individual ship firepower over coordinated tactics. "First salvo in 30 seconds, announced the tactical officer. Took a deep breath and tried to calm his nerves. In 30 seconds, beings were going to start dying. Ships would be destroyed. And somewhere in the middle of all that chaos, he would need to keep the Harmony functional and fighting. The first exchange of fire lit up space like a miniature star being born. Dozens of plasma beams and missile trails crossed the void between the two fleets, followed by the brilliant flashes of impacts and explosions. Both sides scored hits, and both sides lost ships in the opening moments. Watched his damage control board as the Harmony shook under near misses. A heavy cruiser had targeted them specifically, and its gunners were good. Very good. "Hull breach on Deck 7, reported a damage control team. "We're sealing it now." "Port plasma cannon offline," called the weapons officer. "Targeting systems damaged." His hands flew over his console, rerouting power and redistributing life support resources to compensate for the damage. This was what he had been trained for during the past 6 months. Keeping a warship functional while enemy weapons tried to turn it into scrap metal. "Engineering, we need more power to the forward shields," demanded Commander from the bridge. "Giving you everything I can," replied, diverting power from non-essential systems. "But if we take many more hits like that last one, we're going to lose shield coherency." On the main tactical display, he could see the battle developing into a brutal slugging match. The coalition ships were more maneuverable and had better defensive systems, but the vessels mounted heavier weapons and had thicker armor. Neither side was gaining a clear advantage. But slowly, inevitably, the numbers began to tell. The fleet had started with 61 ships. Task Force 7 had 42. Even if they traded ships 1 for 1, which they weren't quite managing, the coalition would run out of vessels first. "Admiral Ra to all ships," came the fleet commander's voice. We're falling back to position beta, fighting retreat, maintain formation discipline. Felt his heart sink. A fighting retreat meant they were losing. It was the right tactical decision, the smart move that would preserve as many coalition ships as possible while still delaying the enemy advance. But it also meant that the fleet would reach 442, with most of their strength intact. The next 2 hours were a nightmare of constant maneuvering and sporadic combat as Task Force 7 fell back toward the inner system. The coalition ships fought brilliantly, using their superior speed and coordination to inflict maximum damage while avoiding decisive engagement. But they couldn't stop the inexorable advance. Lost count of the damage reports and emergency repairs. The Harmony had been hit 17 times, and only excellent engineering and a bit of luck had kept her in the fight. Around the fleet, other ships hadn't been so fortunate. The destroyer Swift Justice had been destroyed early in the battle. The cruiser Endeavor was limping along on backup power with half her weapons offline. But they had given better than they got. At least 19 ships had been destroyed or disabled, including 2 heavy cruisers. The enemy fleet was still formidable, but they had paid a price for their advance. The problem was that it wasn't enough. Even with their losses, they still outnumbered the coalition forces, and they were now close enough to 442 to begin their attack on the planet. "All ships, this is Admiral Ra," came the fleet commander's voice, tight with strain. "Long-range sensors show the enemy preparing to bombard civilian targets. We're going to have to make a stand." Understood what that meant. No more fighting retreat, no more tactical maneuvering. They were going to plant themselves between the fleet and the planet and fight until someone surrendered or everyone was dead. "Chief," he called to, "how are we doing on power reserves?" "We're at 63% of normal capacity," she replied. "But I can give you emergency power for maybe 20 minutes if you need it." 20 minutes? Did some quick calculations. In a close-range battle against superior numbers, most ships would be dead or disabled within 15 minutes. 20 minutes of emergency power might be enough to make a difference. If they could survive long enough to use it. "All hands prepare for close engagement," Admiral announced. "We're going to buy those civilians as much time as we can." The final phase of the battle began when the Blood Tide opened fire on orbital defense platforms. The massive dreadnoughts' weapons were designed for planetary bombardment, and the defense platforms were never meant to withstand that kind of firepower. They died one by one in brilliant explosions that lit up the planet's night side. Task Force 7 accelerated toward the fleet at maximum speed, abandoning all pretense of defensive maneuvering. This was a charge, pure and simple, an attempt to get close enough to do maximum damage before being destroyed. Watched his displays as the distance closed rapidly. 5,000 kilometers, 3,000, 1,000. At point-blank range, every shot was a hit, and every hit was potentially fatal. The Harmony targeted a heavy cruiser and poured everything she had into its shields. Plasma beams and torpedo warheads lit up the enemy vessel's defensive barriers, overloading them in a cascade of brilliant energy discharges. For a moment, thought they had won. Then the cruiser's return fire hit them like the hammer of an angry god. "Multiple hull breaches," shouted a damage control officer. "We're losing atmosphere on decks 4 through 7. "Main reactor offline," called someone else, "switching to backup power." Its board lit up like a constellation of disaster. Every system on the ship was either damaged or failing, but somehow, impossibly, they were still alive and still fighting. "Emergency power," he called to, "give me everything you've got." The chief's 6 arms moved like a conductor directing an orchestra, bringing backup systems online and channeling power from sources that probably weren't designed to handle that kind of load. Lights that had dimmed suddenly brightened. Weapons that had been powering down came back to full charge. For 20 precious minutes, the Harmony fought like a ship twice her size. And around them, the rest of Task Force 7 was doing the same thing. Every captain, every crew member, every being in the coalition fleet was giving everything they had to protect the civilians on. It was magnificent, it was hopeless, and it was exactly what it expected from his new comrades. The battle raged for 18 minutes before the first coalition ship broke off. The heavy cruiser Unyielding had taken so much damage that her captain was forced to withdraw before she exploded and took her crew with her. Then the destroyer Quick Strike followed, her engines failing just as enemy fire found her ammunition storage. One by one, the ships of Task Force 7 were forced to retreat or were destroyed outright. But they had accomplished their mission. The fleet had been so savaged by the close-range battle that they had been forced to break off their bombardment of the planet. 800,000 civilians were still alive because 42 coalition ships had been willing to die to protect them. Was trying to restart the main reactor when Admiral's voice came over the intercom one last time. "This is the Admiral. I'm receiving word from the planet that the civilian evacuation is complete. All non-essential personnel have been successfully relocated to safe systems." The engineering bay was silent except for the hum of backup life support systems. Around, the surviving members of the engineering crew looked at each other with expressions of amazement and exhaustion. They had won, not the battle perhaps, but the thing that mattered. 800,000 lives saved. The Empire's coordinated attack had failed at 442, and word of that failure would spread throughout the galaxy. The Coalition had proven that they would fight for their values, and that some things were worth dying for. Had learned that lesson 6 months ago when he chose to save 47 children. Now, an entire task force had learned the same lesson on a much larger scale. And somewhere in the galaxy, Amy and Carlos were safe on their refugee station, protected by the sacrifice of beings they would never meet, but who had chosen to value their lives above their own safety. The frozen war had begun, but the Coalition had shown that their hearts were not frozen at all. They were still capable of choices that logic and embraced hope. And sometimes that made all the difference. Frozen war, inflexible sacrifice, the human who earned the medal. Commander stood in the observation deck of the Coalition space station Unity, watching the controlled chaos of the largest military buildup in galactic history. 3 months had passed since the Battle of, and the war had spread to 47 star systems. The Empire's initial coordinated strikes had failed, but that had only made them more dangerous. Now they fought with the desperation of a predator that had missed its killing blow. Through the massive viewport, could see ships from every Coalition member species. The elegant curves of destroyers, their hulls gleaming with an inner blue light. The massive, fortress-like battleships of the bristling with weapon emplacements. The living crystal constructs of the fleet, beautiful and deadly as frozen starlight. And scattered throughout the formation, the practical, blocky designs that marked human engineering. But it wasn't the ships that drew his attention. It was the beings inside them. In the 3 months since 442, had been promoted twice and transferred to Admiral Ra's strategic planning staff. His job now was to analyze battle reports and develop new tactics for fighting an enemy that seemed to grow more ruthless with every engagement. The work was intellectually challenging, but it kept him away from the engineering bays where he felt most useful. Today, however, he wasn't thinking about tactics or strategy. He was thinking about a message that had arrived on his personal communicator an hour ago. "Commander, you have an appointment with Admiral Ra in 10 minutes, announced his aide, a young named whose translucent features reflected the starlight outside the station. Nodded and straightened his uniform. In the 3 months since his promotion, he had grown more comfortable with the protocols and procedures of Coalition military service. But he still felt slightly out of place among career officers who had spent decades preparing for command. Admiral Ra's office was located in the command section of Unity, with a direct view of the assembled fleet. The Admiral herself was a species known for their methodical thinking and unshakable determination. Her scales were a deep purple that indicated advanced age and experience, and her forearms moved with the precise economy of motion that marked a consummate professional. "Sit down, Commander," she said without looking up from the holographic display that dominated her desk. "I've been reviewing your tactical analyses from the Rigel engagement. Interesting conclusions." Took the indicated chair and waited. The Rigel engagement had been a disaster for Coalition forces, a carefully planned ambush that had cost them 12 ships and nearly 3,000 lives. His after-action report had been brutally honest about the mistakes that led to the defeat. "You argue that our primary tactical weakness is predictability," the Admiral continued. "That commanders have learned to anticipate our standard responses to various combat situations." "Yes, ma'am. We've been fighting by the book for 3 months, and the enemy has read that book. They know how Coalition forces will respond to flanking maneuvers, how we'll react to divided enemy formations, how we prioritize targets during engagement. Admiral Ra finally looked up from her display, fixing with the intense gaze that made her one of the most effective commanders in the fleet. And your recommendation? We need to start thinking like the enemy, not in terms of their goals or their values, but in terms of their tactical flexibility. They don't have a unified tactical doctrine because their empire is too diverse. Their ship captains are used to adapting to unexpected situations. Gestured toward the viewport, where the coalition fleet continued its careful maneuvers. We've been trying to impose order on chaos. Maybe we should try embracing controlled chaos instead. The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, her four arms moving to manipulate different controls on her desk display. The hologram shifted to show a detailed tactical projection of the Vega system, where intelligence indicated a major fleet was gathering for another assault. Explain how you would apply this philosophy to a concrete situation, she said. Studied the projection, noting the positions of enemy ships and the likely approaches they would use for an attack on the vegan colonies. Standard coalition response would be to position our fleet at the edge of the system and force a direct engagement. Textbook defensive tactics, maximum use of our superior coordination and firepower. Correct, and they will expect that. They'll have planned for it. They might even have positioned their forces specifically to take advantage of our predictable response. Manipulated the hologram, moving coalition fleet markers into an unusual formation. Instead, we could try something unexpected. Deploy our forces in 3 separate groups, each one apparently vulnerable but actually supported by the others. When the move to exploit what looks like a tactical error, we spring the trap. Admiral Ra studied the projection with the intensity of a hunter examining tracks. Risky. If they don't take the bait, our forces would be divided and vulnerable to defeat in detail. Yes, ma'am. But if they do take the bait, we could destroy a significant portion of their fleet while suffering minimal casualties ourselves. And you believe this approach is worth the risk? Thought about the message on his personal communicator, the one that had been weighing on his mind for the past hour. Admiral, we've been fighting this war for 3 months, and we're barely holding our own. They have more ships, more soldiers, and more resources than we do. If we keep fighting conventionally, we're going to lose eventually. Even with our technological advantages. Technology only matters if you can bring it to bear effectively. They have learned to neutralize a lot of our advantages by changing their tactics. We need to start changing ours. Admiral leaned back in her chair, her 4 arms folding in a gesture that indicated deep thought. Commander, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you believe the coalition can win this war? He was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything he had seen and learned over the past 3 months. The desperate battle at 442, where 42 ships had held off 61 enemy vessels long enough to save 800,000 civilians. The disaster at Rigel, where careful planning had been undone by enemy unpredictability. The grinding attrition of dozens of smaller engagements where both sides bled ships and crew without decisive result. I believe we can win, he said finally. But not if we keep fighting the way we've been fighting. The Empire has one major weakness. They're not really united. Their different species work together, but they don't trust each other completely. If we could find a way to exploit that. Go on. The fleet structure is built around individual ship captains making independent decisions. That gives them tactical flexibility, but it also means they can't coordinate complex maneuvers the way we can. If we could force them into situations where they needed tight coordination. Paused, working through the implications of his own thoughts. Admiral, what if we could make them choose between their natural tactical flexibility and the coordination they need to counter our strengths? Admiral Ra's scales shifted to a lighter shade of purple, a sign of interest among her species. Elaborate. We've been trying to fight them ship to ship, where their individual initiative gives them an advantage. But what if we force them to fight fleet to fleet, where our coordination gives us the edge? Manipulated the holographic display again, showing a theoretical engagement where coalition forces used complex, synchronized maneuvers that would be impossible for independently operating enemy ships to counter effectively. The key would be timing, he continued. We'd need to engage their entire fleet simultaneously, so no individual captain could break off and use independent tactics. Force them to either coordinate their response, which they're not good at, or fights separately against a coordinated enemy. Admiral Ra studied the projection for several minutes before speaking. Commander, you're proposing a fundamental change in coalition tactical doctrine, the kind of change that could win the war or lose it spectacularly. Yes, ma'am. It would require the approval of the Coalition Military Council and buy-in from fleet commanders of 16 different species. Many of them have been fighting the same way for centuries. I understand. The Admiral stood up and moved to the viewport, looking out at the massive fleet assembled around Unity. There's something else. Intelligence has confirmed that they are planning a major offensive against the Sol system. Earth itself is under threat. Felt his blood turn cold. Earth was the member of the coalition, but it had quickly become a symbol of the Alliance's commitment to diversity and inclusion. An attack on humanities would be both strategically and symbolically devastating. When, he asked. 6 weeks, maybe less. They're assembling the largest fleet in history, over 300 ships. Even if we commit every available coalition vessel, we'd still be outnumbered 2-1. Did some quick calculations in his head. 300 ships represented more firepower than had ever been assembled in one place in galactic history. Against odds like that, conventional tactics would be suicide. Admiral, this might be exactly the kind of situation where unconventional tactics could make the difference. Explain. A fleet that large would be impossible to coordinate effectively using standard tactics. They'd have to operate in smaller groups, which would create opportunities for us to engage them piecemeal. And their commanders would be under enormous pressure to succeed, which might make them more likely to take tactical risks. Admiral Ra turned back from the viewport, her expression unreadable. Commander, I'm going to make you an offer, but before I do, I want you to think very carefully about what you're signing up for. Ma'am, I'm recommending you for promotion to captain and assignment as tactical commander for the defense of Sol. You would have operational control over a task force of 40 ships and the authority to implement whatever tactical doctrine you think gives us the best chance of success. Felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. 40 ships and their crews, potentially tens of thousands of coalition military personnel, would be depending on his tactical decisions. And beyond that, the entire human species would be counting on him to help defend there. What about Admiral and the Harmony? He asked. Admiral will be commanding the main battle line. The Harmony has been refitted and upgraded since 442. She's stronger than ever, and she'll need an experienced engineering officer. That was when realized what the Admiral was really offering him. Not just a promotion and a new command, but a chance to return to the Harmony and the crew that had become his military family. Chief, Dr. Ra, even Young, who had questioned his judgment during that first commission hearing 6 months ago. There's one more thing, Admiral Ra continued. The personal message you received an hour ago, it was from Amy, wasn't it? Was surprised that she knew about his private communications, but he nodded. She's 14 now, living with an adoptive family on Titan Station. She wanted to thank me for what happened on the New Hope. And her brother, Carlos. He's doing well, too. They both are. Amy says she's thinking about applying to the Coalition Academy when she turns 16. She wants to be an engineer. Admiral Ross smiled, an expression that looked fierce and proud on her predatory features. Children saved by your sacrifice, growing up to serve the coalition that protected them. There's a certain poetic justice in that. Thought about Amy's message, the careful words of a teenager trying to express gratitude for something that had fundamentally changed her life. She and Carlos had grown up safe because he had made one decision in a moment of crisis 6 months ago. Now that decision had rippled outward, affecting not just their lives, but the lives of everyone they would touch in the years to come. Captain, Admiral Ra said formally, do you accept command of Task Force 12 and responsibility for implementing new tactical doctrine for the defense of Sol? Stood up and saluted, the gesture now second nature after months of military service. I accept, Admiral, and I won't let you down. I know you won't, but more importantly, I know you won't let them down. She gestured toward the viewport, where the lights of the Coalition fleet sparkled like stars in the darkness. Every being out there is counting on us to prove that the Coalition's values are worth fighting for. As left Admiral Ra's office, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, He had been a civilian engineer on a passenger transport, looking forward to a quiet life building infrastructure on an agricultural world. Today, he was a coalition captain preparing to defend humanities against the largest enemy fleet in galactic history. The change seemed impossible, but it had happened one decision at a time. Each choice had seemed small in the moment: giving up his escape pod to save children, accepting a military commission, volunteering for dangerous assignments, challenging established tactical doctrine. But together, those choices had built something larger than he had ever imagined. Now he was faced with the biggest choice of all: how to defend Earth against overwhelming odds while staying true to the values that made the coalition worth defending in the first place. Captain made his way to the docking bay where a shuttle was waiting to take him back to the Harmony. There was work to do, plans to make, and a war to win. But first, he wanted to send a message to Amy to let her know that her dreams of joining the Coalition Academy were exactly the kind of hope that made all their sacrifices worthwhile. The frozen war was far from over, but the Coalition had something the Empire would never understand: the willingness to sacrifice everything for beings they had never met, because it was the right thing to do. And sometimes, as had learned 6 months ago in the escape pod bay of the New Hope, that made all the difference in the universe. The shuttle's engines hummed to life as settled into his seat, and began composing his message to a 14-year-old girl whose life had been saved by his inflexible determination to do what was right, no matter the cost. Tomorrow, he would begin planning humanity's defense against impossible odds. Tonight, he would remind himself why that defense mattered. As the shuttle pulled away from Unity and headed toward the lights of the Coalition fleet, smiled for the first time in weeks. The war was far from won, but they had something worth fighting for. And that, he was beginning to understand, was the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. 3 weeks later, Captain stood on the bridge of the Coalition heavy cruiser Harmony, watching the largest enemy fleet in galactic history drop out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. 317 warships, arranged in a formation that stretched across millions of kilometers of space like a constellation of malevolent stars. Against them stood 84 coalition vessels, the largest defensive fleet Earth had ever seen, but still hopelessly outnumbered by an enemy that had come to destroy humanities. "All ships, this is Admiral," came the familiar voice of former commander over the fleet communications channel. "Remember, our job is not to defeat the enemy fleet. Our job is to protect Earth long enough for the civilian evacuation to be completed." Checked his tactical displays one more time. The plan he had developed with Admiral Ra was untested and risky, built around principles that challenged decades of established coalition military doctrine. But conventional tactics against odds like these would be suicide. "Captain," called Lieutenant Commander from the communications station, "I'm receiving reports from all task force commanders. They're ready to execute your plan." Looked around the bridge of the Harmony, seeing the familiar faces of beings who had become his military family over the past 9 months. Chief at the engineering station, her 6 arms moving with practiced precision. Dr. Ra monitoring the medical status of the crew. Dozens of other officers and crew members who had trusted him with their lives. In 3 minutes, he would give the order that would either save Earth or doom the Coalition fleet to destruction. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. Then he thought about Amy, now 16 years old and accepted into the Coalition Academy as she had dreamed. About Carlos, planning to study xenobiology so he could help build bridges between different species. About the millions of humans on Earth who were counting on the Coalition to protect them. About 47 children who were alive today, because someone had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. Captain took a deep breath and opened a channel to the entire Coalition fleet. "All ships, this is Captain. Today we prove that the Coalition's greatest strength isn't our technology or our numbers. It's our willingness to stand together when everything we value is at stake. All task forces, execute Plan Omega." The battle for Earth was about to begin, and the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. But whatever happened next, knew they would face it together, with the kind of inflexible determination that had brought them this far. The frozen war had become very hot indeed. But their hearts remained warm, and their resolve unshakable. And sometimes, that was enough to change the course of history itself.